I'm of the ilk that soft skills are more important for a variety of reasons. For obviously communication, the collaborative spirit, engagement, being here, you can certainly, and I've interviewed people that have that, super technical skills in application development, programming languages, whatever it may be. But unless they can collaborate on a project, provide updates, show a level of engagement, show a level of enthusiasm, so bigger picture, I'm more of a soft skills person, and I've seen like super technical, wonderful people that are brilliant, but, have maybe they're inhibited or they're not sure how to either respond to a question or collaborate effectively or show resolve in a certain situation. So, I generally prefer that scope. And you're hearing that more in the industry of people that are preferring more soft skills, given, cross-collaborative functions or different things that might be needed on a project or a launch or things like that. So I'm more of a soft skills guy. I will say by and large, it's probably because of match. And I do think that in a reactive market, especially today's market, recruiters get inundated with people that don't read the rec. They don't read the job description, simply. They don't look at the level. They don't look at the function. They don't look at the industry. They don't look at the geography. I just recently had a web developer opening here in New York, and the requirement was pretty hard. Hybrid role, sits on Long Island, 3 days in, 2 days remote. And I was getting kids from Pakistan literally applying for the role, and then they'll IM me on the side saying, "Doug, I'm a great fit for that job." I'm like, "You might be, but dude, you live in Islamabad," right? So I understand the behavioral dynamic and the psychological dynamic. People, they might, if they get laid off or they're in transition and they're having a hard time finding. So it's so important just to read the description, try and elevate your resume or your LinkedIn profile to align with those particular keywords. It could be, requirements. It could be 6 of them, 7 of them, 5 of them. Remember, recruiters are incentivized by placing talent. So we don't purposely want jobs to be open. We want our clients or our partners or our stakeholders to be fulfilled, and we want the best talent possible. So that little extra due diligence will help, because we get inundated, and a lot of times companies, they pivot. They could go through a restructuring. There could be soft financials coming in. There's a variety of reasons why they may not react or not have the resources effectively to react. There might be one HR person handling a 2,000 person company that's also doing benefits and compensation and culture programs and payroll and, oh, by the way, recruiting, right? So they're all their unique situation. But I think that if people take that extra time to really perform that due diligence, customize that resume, it sounds old school because of AI and things like that. But I read every application. I read every resume. These eyes here. So that's kind of my take on it. And I think that speaks, Nicole, to the earlier point around customization, around targeting, and also identifying, because there's a million ways to say customer experience. There's a million ways. Every company has their own vernacular. They have their own requirement structures. So, the better that you understand and align your skills and elevate your skills, elevate your ROI points. Were you a high performer? Were you a salesperson that sold into quotas and beat quotas? Did you gain brand impressions, whatever the metric might be, the performance metric that would be relevant to that role. So I think, it's the same point where, the better that you target and refine and speak exactly to those roles and exactly where you present those skills and present those performance highlights, that's where you're going to get better identity. Yeah, one thing that people seem to be shy about, Nicole, is they don't call the company. They might. I'm not saying that, I'm saying that very broadly. They'll infer that the black hole of the application process is it, right? And I entertain these conversations. Somebody might, referring to my web developer from Hyderabad earlier, good for him to reach out to me. He wasn't a fit geographically, clearly. But, if somebody applies for a job and LinkedIn is really more for the B2B, Indeed might be for more B2C or field roles or hospitality. They're a little bit different, but by and large, regardless of the platform, if the role says this role reports to the director of recruiting, and you do a little sleuth work and find out that Doug Wald is the director of recruiting, or the VP of recruiting, and you find him on LinkedIn and you send him a message. And again, we're incentivized by placing talent. It's important for us. It's part of our performances. It's part of our brand. It's part of our credibility in the market. So if somebody reaches out and says, "Doug, I applied for this role," and I look and they line up, I'm picking up the phone. So it's fine to contact a hiring manager. It's fine to contact a connection. If Joe knows Mary at company X that's hiring for this particular role, ask for the connection. That's why LinkedIn was developed in the beginning, to be more of before it became an applicant tracking system, essentially. So, so make those connections. Don't be afraid to reach out to people. It's perfectly fine. I'm completely accessible, and I'm fine with entertaining those conversations. That's a great and thoughtful question, Nicole. AI, just the general tone of AI has been so pervasive in the market. People don't understand it. It's not adopted in certain places. I think for job seekers, making sure, again, due diligence, making sure that, you go to ChatGPT and it blasts out a version of a resume, and you have to nip and tuck it and edit it accordingly to not only meet your functional value, but also the tone is very important, as you say. And as for me, I like knowing who you are, not just what you've done. I like knowing, and back to soft skills, I like the fact that you might be collaborative, you might have a certain energy, or you understand how to work in agile environments. Things like that. So, because I have to tell that story to my client, if I got a great candidate for a great role, I have to paint the picture and tell the story of why Joe is great for this role or why Mary is great for that role, right? So gaining that, doing the extra due diligence to make sure that you're represented properly. And importantly, when you get into conversation and interview phases, you have to be representative of yourself, right? On the resume side of it, right? But no, I like knowing the picture of the person that is behind that resume and is applying for that role, and do they fit culturally? Are they quick learners, or whatever those attributes might be that would be helpful for them in that environment. So the due diligence is important. And remember, AI, a lot of it's garbage in, garbage out, right? So given that, it really is very important, because I could sniff out an AI resume a mile away. So that extra little bit of due diligence, I think, is really is helpful there. Well, and this could be going back to the AI and just general research, Nicole, understanding what your general competitive benchmarks would look like in the field. So if you're a field engineer in Kansas City in biotechnology, or whatever your industry is, whatever your level is, you can certainly incorporate your education, any certifications or things that are relative. So I would just go in with a suggested range for your next role. So when you're in an interview phase, and I ask this question regularly, what is your anticipated compensation expectations for your next role? And they give a broad range, and by and large, people are in the range. Sometimes they shoot high, sometimes they undersell themselves. But if they do that research and look at multiple sources of geography, of function, of level, geography is going to be different, industry is going to be different, they're all going to vary. So if you understand where your compensation journey has been and where you've been in a trajectory, and then looking at those benchmarks, and obviously now, because of it tight, it's an employer-centric market now. So salaries might be coming down a bit, they're getting squeezed a bit. So, but doing that extra, reporting and due diligence and research, I think is most helpful. And I just actually had this situation very recently with a marketing manager in Los Angeles that, was coming into a marketing role for a manufacturing company and is the only marketing practitioner in the company. So, I painted a picture of, all right, these are the requirements. She got up the dialogue phase and got to the president of the company, and the president of the company is like, okay, you're doing everything, right? There's no team, it's all you, right? So she was like, well, okay, well, given that, and again, presented a legitimate range, on target, on benchmark, within budget. And then she came back to me and said, well, Doug, given the construct of the role, when you get into the weeds of the logistics of the role and the requirements and the lack or resources or whatever, she's like, well, I think I want this, not that. And I'm like, you're completely well within your right. You're, knowing industry benchmarks or what compensation frameworks look like around the country for a variety of different industries and functions. She was legit, so I was like, and I go back to the client and go, hey, so I represent the client, but I'm her advocate too. And I present that balance and that back and forth. So the client did see the merit, and I did say, that particular candidate had an MBA, spoke 4 languages, worked with very, very technical content, and was an ideal fit for that role. And I said, you know what? She's probably worth another $15,000 or $20,000 on top. But if she's within your budget, this is what you're willing to spend. And look at your bigger picture. You're going to elevate your brand. You're going to elevate your demand generation. You're going to engage your sales teams, have better engagement with your customers and partners. So it's money well spent. I'm a marketing guy, so for me, it's it's easy to say. But it was literally a scenario that I just went through over the last couple of days. And so, candidates, if they gain a little more understanding and understand what their worth is, measured against the market, it's completely viable. Okay, to my earlier point, don't spray and pray. Please, don't do it. And I will use data for this, Nicole. 80% of applicants on job boards online, LinkedIn, Indeed, Zip, name it, they don't read the job, period. Very simply. So back to the due diligence part, understanding how to customize. And it sounds arduous, and I understand if people are applying to 100 jobs or 200 jobs, the tail wags the dog. It's about them, right? It's about the job and the hiring team and the customer. How do you best position that? So again, if it's going to be soft skills, hard skills, speaking to your id, your profile, so to speak. But literally, if somebody goes to a LinkedIn job, they see it fits them, it's great, and they look and they see 100 people applied to that job in a day, and they get defeated. They go, but I'm telling you, right, as God is my witness, 80% of those people are not relevant. They just don't read the jobs. So again, that due diligence and that targeting will elevate you to the top 20% and put you in consideration phase. And then, if you're accessible to the location, the industry, whatever it may be, but 80%, and this is not anecdotal, this is hard data. This is my data, again, working on 15, 20, 30 roles across the country in different markets, in different shapes and sizes, in different industries, from C-suite to contributor. People need to read the job. Read the job, don't spray and pray, target your stuff. One extra point there, Nicole, if I may. There could be a level of depth of proficiency and experience in a certain function. So, I worked in, Epic EMR, years ago, and I knew it, but I haven't worked in it lately. So that's an 80-20 rule that we'll determine. So if it's somebody that hasn't worked in the system in 20 years, maybe not so, if it's a hard requirement. So if there's a little gray matter, most of the requirements fit, most of the alignment fits. And if there's a couple of questions, I'll ask, okay, have you worked in Epic? What were your application uses? How did you roll it out? Did you use it? Did you train people? Whatever it is, right? So, and then I'll gauge that level of proficiency, and I'll tell the candidate, look, you're gonna have to speak to this, either in a demo or, whatever the case may be. So if somebody has good confidence in their proficiency in a tool or a system or a process, it's still viable. Yeah, and that's case by case, Nicole. I work a lot in marketing, so I work with creative projects, so I require portfolio samples to be submitted. I require content portfolios to be submitted, and I'm the gatekeeper. So I'll be like, okay, they work in financial services, they work in healthcare, they work in non-for-profits. I'm just one of my ad agency clients that I work with, and I want to see a breadth of content. And not that they have to do a lot of work there in that respect. They're submitting a profile, but they have to align their content of the needs of the business. So they don't want to see gaming. They don't want to see stuff outside of their space, right? So I really try to provide those guardrails. And in terms of the extra project work, they all vary. Sometimes they'll say, okay, build us a go-to-market plan, for, a widget company, so, and I'll say, look, this is the requirement, and sometimes companies will recompensate them for their time, as a temp assignment, and saying, okay, we'll pay you X amount for your time. And if it's, discretionary or things like that. So, you get into some of those games too, especially with development projects, coding projects, in development and software, things of that nature. So they might say, okay, code me a string to do XXX in Linux for these platforms and these profiles, right? So there's some of that too that takes shape, but it really, it's the rubber road situation, right? If it's a completely crazy ask and the candidate doesn't have the ability or the time or the access to be able to deliver that type of project or that deliverable, they can take a walk, right? On their own, right? Say, I'm not going to do this. But I think as a recruiter, it's important for us to mediate, what the ask is, and also go back to the client. And the client says, okay, we need a marketing person, a contributor to build a go-to-market strategy for the world in 32 markets and all these different segments and pricing plans. I'm like, dude, that's not going to fly, right? So again, it's up to us as industry experts to monitor that, to mediate it, and show them what's viable and what's not, and what that level can produce and what they can't. But I think for a candidate, most of the asks are legitimate. But if they get a little crazy and they get a little arduous, then we step in and say, okay, and then they'll wonder, why do we have no candidates? This job's been open for 4 months. And I'm like, well, your qualification process is a little too arduous. So it's really contingent on, the heat of the role and the severity of the role and where they need to fill it. So, but by and large, most of the projects I've worked on have been legit. Great question and thoughtful question. I would say in today's market today, we're hearing the term job hugging, right? Where people are seeing the market, and the market, Nicole, this is not 2020. This is not 2008. We're kind of like 2014. There's a lot of the trade discussions have created a stagnant market. A lot of companies, especially in manufacturing, outside of services. Services seem to be doing okay. Financial services, healthcare, they seem to be doing okay. Advertising, okay. But anybody that's manufacturing a product overseas and shipping it overseas or importing it overseas, they're in pricing discussions. They don't know how to bill. They don't know how to price. They don't know how to build their logistics plans. So I think that, it depends upon the market. It depends upon the industry. If the industry is really getting hammered, maybe measuring that job hugging and staying put for that stability and that continuity in your career, rather than being aspirational and saying, okay, yeah, I want to take the next step, or I want to jump into a different industry or do something that's more of their charter and their mission, right? So, but I would say in today's market, because there's so much uncertainty, there's a lot of volatility in Q1 around April when the trade conversations really ramped up globally, and companies really didn't know how to budget for it. They were budgeted, but they didn't know what their headcount looked like, what their variable costs, their fixed costs, they didn't know. So, and they still don't know, so you hear this on earnings calls right now. CEOs, okay, Best Buy, why is Best Buy not, they had them on earlier today. And they were like, well, we don't know. A lot of our manufacturers are overseas. They ship overseas. We're seeing, some of these trade conversations of what pricing, what, subsets of certain products are being developed. How are they priced? How are they, what's the logistics around there? So my general advice would be, if you're not at DEFCON 5, hair on fire, get me out, I would stay put. I think the EU and maybe even Canada, I think the EU more so for people in continental Africa and those areas. The US, the visas are getting tighter. But and again, that's a fluid situation. We just saw that buck down with China. Now they just opened up 500,000 visas for Chinese students and Chinese nationals coming into the US. Again, it's still a fluid situation, but I do think that just in access and cost, I think the EU is probably the best bet for those pursuits. Remote jobs are, and again, a fluid situation because, companies generally are liking or preferring that their personnel be within an access of a headquarters or regional HQ. Not that the remote jobs don't exist, but unless they're a support model, it really depends upon the role. If they're in technical support, they can be anywhere, as long as they're within a time zone access to customer sets and such. So I would say internationally, because I work with a lot of mid-market companies and SMBs and startups, they don't sponsor. They generally don't have the cost models to be able to do it. Larger companies do, but even in tech, a lot of companies that we're sponsoring in tech, they're dialing that back a bit. They're looking at their margins and their costs and what are primary markets and go-to-market products for them versus things that might be a secondary or an incubator or things that are not part of the core business, right? So companies are looking at those costs. So I would say, just from a migration and a career path perspective, I would say the EU probably has more opportunity for those types of candidates.